Welcome to Historian Diary. Today I will tell you a story about Rome. But this is not a story about conquests or glory or empire. This is a story about gender, about a 14-year-old who became emperor and immediately declared, "I am a woman." About a ruler who wore makeup, blonde wigs, and worked in a palace brothel. About someone who offered half the Roman treasury to any physician who could give them female genitalia. This is the story of Elagabalus, the transgender emperor who ruled Rome from 218 to 222 CE, and it happened 1800 years before the word transgender existed. My hand is trembling as I read these ancient sources, written by Romans who witnessed this. Cassius Dio, a senator who was there. The Historia Augusta, contemporary accounts describing an emperor who defied every Roman concept of masculinity, who married a man and called himself empress, who lined up the most well-endowed men in Rome for a competition. This is documented history from people who saw it happen. Comment below where you're watching from, because what I'm about to tell you is real. A teenager in ancient Rome explored gender identity in ways that wouldn't be discussed again for nearly 2,000 years. Let me start at the beginning. The person we call Elagabalus was born in 203 CE in Emesa, Syria. Born into the Severan dynasty, assigned male at birth, given the name Varius Avitus Bassianus. But from childhood, this person served as a priest of the sun god Elagabal, a deity whose worship included gender-fluid rituals, cross-dressing, and ecstatic performance. The young priest wore makeup, elaborate costumes, and, according to sources, displayed what Romans called feminine behavior from an early age. In 218 CE, through political maneuvering by the grandmother Julia Maesa, this 14-year-old priest became emperor of Rome, took the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, but history knows this emperor as Elagabalus, named after the god. And immediately, this teenager began to transform the Roman imperial court in ways that shocked the entire empire. Please like this video, because what happened next was unprecedented in Roman history. Elagabalus wore women's clothing, not secretly, not occasionally, constantly, as emperor in public. The sources describe elaborate silk gowns, makeup, jewelry, blonde wigs. Cassius Dio, a contemporary senator, writes that Elagabalus wore a necklace, armlets, and a crown, and his face was painted with white and red. This was the emperor of Rome in what Romans understood as women's attire, and Elagabalus insisted on being addressed with feminine language. But it went further than clothing. Elagabalus sought surgical transition. In the 3rd century, Cassius Dio records that the emperor asked the physicians to contrive a woman's vagina in his body by means of an incision. This is from 220 CE, 1800 years ago. A Roman emperor seeking what we would now call gender confirmation surgery. The technology didn't exist. The understanding didn't exist. But the desire was there, documented by a contemporary witness. Think about what this means. In 220 CE, someone in power expressed gender dysphoria, sought medical transition, used the resources of the Roman Empire to try to physically transition. This isn't modern. This isn't new. This is ancient, and it's documented. Where are you watching from? Comment below, because this is where it gets sexually explicit. Elagabalus married 5 times in 4 years as emperor. The first 4 marriages were to women, political arrangements. But the 5th marriage was different. In 221 CE, Elagabalus married a man, a slave named Hierocles, a former chariot driver. And here's what the sources tell us. Elagabalus insisted on being called Hierocles' wife, not husband, wife. The emperor of Rome married a man and took the feminine role. Wanted to be called empress, Cassius Dio writes, he was bestowed in marriage and was termed wife, mistress, and queen. He delighted to be called the mistress, the wife, the queen of Hierocles. This is a Roman senator describing his emperor, a 14-year-old assigned male at birth who married a man and wanted to be his wife. In 221 CE, the wedding ceremony was public. Traditional Roman marriage rites, except the emperor was the bride, wore bridal attire, took the feminine role in the marriage, and apparently consummated the marriage in the receptive role, which for Romans was the ultimate violation of masculine imperial dignity. The emperor of Rome was being penetrated by a slave, and was happy about it, but Elagabalus didn't stop there. The emperor set up a brothel in the palace and worked in it. Cassius Dio describes this. He set aside a room in the palace and there committed his indecencies, always standing naked at the door of the room as the harlots do, and shaking the curtain which hung from gold rings, while in a soft and melting voice he solicited the passers-by. Read that again. The emperor of Rome, standing naked in a palace doorway, soliciting customers, working as a prostitute, in what the sources describe as the feminine role. Cassius Dio continues. There were, of course, men who had been specially instructed to play their part. For as in other matters, so in this business too, he had numerous agents who sought out those who could best please him by their foulness. This wasn't secret. This was the emperor's known behavior, palace prostitution, with Elagabalus in the receptive sexual role. Cassius Dio, who was there, witnessed the aftermath of this, describes it with disgust. But he describes it because it happened. Subscribe to Historian Diary if you haven't already, because this gets more explicit. Elagabalus held a competition to find the most well-endowed men in Rome. Cassius Dio records he would collect in the palace all the prostitutes and pimps of the city and deliver speeches to them, calling them his comrades. But more than that, the emperor reportedly gathered men specifically selected for genital size. The sources suggest Elagabalus wanted to experience receptive sex with the largest possible partners, was seeking sexual experiences that affirmed a feminine identity. The emperor also reportedly asked physicians repeatedly about feminizing treatments, about ways to make the body more feminine, about removing male genitalia and creating female anatomy. The surgery wasn't possible in 220 CE, but Elagabalus offered enormous sums, half the treasury according to one source, though that's likely exaggeration. But the request itself? That's documented. A Roman emperor seeking physical transition to female anatomy. For context, this is 1800 years before modern endocrinology, 1700 years before the word transgender existed. But the experience Elagabalus described, feeling that one's body doesn't match one's gender identity, that experience is ancient, and it's documented in a Roman emperor. What are you thinking right now? Comment below. Is this a trans man? A gender-fluid person? Something else entirely? Modern scholars debate how to interpret Elagabalus. Some argue this was a transgender woman, someone assigned male who identified as female. Others say gender-fluid or non-binary. Some claim it was sexual preference rather than gender identity. And some ancient historians argue it was political propaganda, that the sources exaggerated to discredit the emperor. But here's what we know for certain. Elagabalus wore women's clothing constantly, sought surgical transition, married a man and took the wife role, wanted to be called empress, worked as a prostitute in the receptive role, asked repeatedly for medical feminization. These are documented behaviors. Whatever modern label we use, the historical reality is clear. This emperor defied Roman gender norms in every possible way. The Romans were horrified, not because homosexual behavior was unknown. Roman men commonly had male sexual partners, but because of the role. In Roman culture, the penetrative role was masculine and acceptable. The receptive role was feminine and shameful. For a citizen, for a free man, and absolutely for an emperor. Elagabalus deliberately chose the receptive role, celebrated it, made it public. That was the unforgivable part. Cassius Dio's disgust is palpable in his writing. He describes Elagabalus as having the soul of a woman. He means it as an insult. But reading it now, 1800 years later, it sounds like a description of someone living their truth, someone expressing a feminine gender identity in a world that had no framework for understanding it. Please like this video and share it. Because this history matters. Elagabalus ruled for only 4 years, from 218 to 222 CE, 14 to 18 years old. And during those 4 years, systematically violated every Roman expectation of imperial masculinity. The Senate hated the emperor. The army grew restless. The grandmother Julia Maesa, who had engineered Elagabalus's rise to power, realized her mistake. This emperor was too radical, too shocking, too unmarketable. On March 11, 222 CE, the Praetorian Guard murdered Elagabalus. 18 years old, they killed Hierocles too, killed the emperor's mother, mutilated the bodies, dragged Elagabalus's corpse through the streets of Rome, threw it in the Tiber River, damned the emperor's memory, tried to erase all records, wanted to pretend Elagabalus had never existed, but they couldn't erase everything. Cassius Dio wrote it down. The Historia Augusta preserved it, the sources survived, and now, 1800 years later, we can read about a teenager who became emperor and immediately began living as a woman, who married a man, who sought surgical transition, who worked as a prostitute, who offered half the Roman treasury for a vagina. This is transgender history, 1800 years old. If you've watched this far, thank you. Comment below. How should we label Elagabalus, transgender woman, gender fluid, something else? I am a historian, and my job is to present what the sources say. Here's what they say. Elagabalus consistently presented as feminine, wore women's clothing, used makeup and wigs, took the receptive sexual role, married a man and insisted on being the wife, asked for surgical transition to female anatomy, wanted to be called empress, not emperor. These are documented facts from contemporary sources. Modern terminology didn't exist in 220 CE. Transgender is a 20th century word. Gender dysphoria is modern medical language. But the experience? The feeling that your body doesn't match your identity, the desire to transition, that experience is ancient. And Elagabalus described it, lived it, used imperial power to explore it. Some historians argue we shouldn't use modern labels for ancient people. That calling Elagabalus transgender imposes modern categories on the past. And they're right that we must be careful. Ancient Rome had different concepts of gender and sexuality than we do. What Elagabalus experienced, they experienced in a Roman cultural context, not a 21st century American one. But here's my response. If we wait for ancient people to use our exact words before we acknowledge their experiences, we erase their reality. Elagabalus said, "I am a woman." Elagabalus said, "I want a vagina." Elagabalus said, "Call me wife, call me empress." We don't need the word transgender to have been invented in 220 CE to recognize what Elagabalus was expressing. The experience of gender dysphoria, of feeling that your assigned sex doesn't match your gender identity, that experience transcends time and culture. It's not modern, it's not Western, it's human. And Elagabalus had it and documented it and lived it as publicly as possible, given the constraints of 3rd century Rome. Subscribe to Historian Diary for more investigations into hidden histories. Write in the comments, what other LGBTQ+ historical figures should I research? Elagabalus, born 203 CE, emperor at 14, dead at 18, lived as a woman, married a man, sought surgical transition, worked as a prostitute, and was murdered for it. The transgender emperor of Rome, 1800 years before Stonewall, 1700 years before the word existed. But the experience, the identity, the courage to live authentically despite everything, that's ancient, that's documented, that's real. The Roman Empire tried to erase Elagabalus, murdered the emperor, mutilated the body, threw it in a river, damned the memory, destroyed records. For 1800 years, Elagabalus was a footnote, a scandalous emperor mentioned briefly then forgotten, a joke about Roman decadence. But the sources survived. Cassius Dio's history, the Historia Augusta, and now we can read them differently. Not as a story of Roman moral decay, but as a story of a teenager exploring gender in the only ways available. Using imperial power to transition as much as 3rd century medicine allowed, living as authentically as possible in a world that had no framework for understanding. Elagabalus wasn't perfect. The emperor was young, inexperienced, sometimes cruel, made political mistakes, governed poorly. But underneath the bad governance and the youth and the mistakes, there's a human story. Someone who knew who they were, someone who insisted on living that truth, even when it meant violating every social norm. Someone who said, I am a woman. I want to be called empress. I want a female body. And I will use every resource I have to live my truth. That courage, that determination, that's remarkable in any era. But in 220 CE, in Rome, as emperor, it's extraordinary. Thank you for watching Historian Diary. This is history, transgender history, ancient history, the kind that shows us that gender diversity isn't new, isn't modern, isn't a trend or a choice or a confusion. It's human, it's ancient, it's documented. Elagabalus, Empress of Rome, dead at 18, remembered for 1800 years, living proof that transgender people have always existed, have always found ways to express their truth, have always been part of human history. The teenager who became emperor and said, I am a woman. Call me empress, give me a vagina, let me be who I am. Ancient Rome tried to erase that story, but it survived. And now you know it. See you next time.